I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Well, I'm here for my last episode edition of Hillbilly Elegy Book Club about Hillbilly Elegy. And even maybe at the beginning, I want to share some thoughts about how I read books, because I'm sure that it continues to puzzle some of my viewers why I would spend time on this book. But actually, the book speaks to a lot of concerns that I have, that I study and that have come out in my own book. And it's written by somebody that is very polarizing. It was written quite a while ago in 2016, so before he became like much of a figure beyond the author of a book. But I guess to kind of help people understand why this doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me, one way or the other, is because my approach to reading and using books is kind of specific. So I wanted to explain that a little bit and maybe encourage you guys to, if you aren't already doing this, to consider doing this with the things that you read. I think at first that it's probably a good idea, and I do this, to disregard the author's background and just focus on the text, because the book is there in front of you. It has information for you to gather, for you to, decide whether you want to accept it or not. It is a work that outlives the author. And it has a sort of life of its own. And you definitely see that coming out for real in Vance's book, because you do see somebody who in 2016 probably thought a little differently than he does now. That doesn't make the book one way or the other less valid, more valid. You have to ask yourself, honestly, disregarding the author, at least for the time being, if the book has some valid points or whatever it is that you're reading. And for me, validity can be based on multiple factors, multiple sources of validity. It could be logic, if the argument just makes sense or it's not very refutable. Sometimes numbers, just sheer facts and numbers. As well as observation and experience, especially if you've had a lot of experience in the area that the person is speaking to, or a lot of life experience, or if you have read many other books that deal with the same sort of problems. I can say I have a little bit of both of those. And I did a lot of thinking about all of those different ways of verifying validity and sort of critique the book on that basis. That's what I do. I don't think that any one of those alone is necessarily the only way to determine if a book is valid. So validity also can be partial and still useful. So you can say, well, I don't agree with this, but that's a decent point. And I've done a lot of that in this series. Honesty is recognizing that your feelings and prejudices might get in the way of reading this book. And therefore, you need to constantly kind of check that. It's not easy. It's really not easy. And it's probably never fully possible, but people can try, and they should. And then realizing that, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, right? That's really true. What I mean by that, I was taught that even as a kid. My dad taught me that. And I think it's been a very good point throughout my life. If you think that ideological or moral or whatever, set of rules that you've sort of adopted, consistency in using those rules is absolutely the height of virtue, you're not going to be a very good human being. And you're not even going to be very rational because no ideological or philosophic system is completely tidy, right? And completely, 100% in order, right? So that there's no room for other points to be made or for minds to be changed, right? Like if you can't change your mind, you have, as I've often said on this channel, a faith and not a philosophy, actually. So, yes, like, don't worship consistency to the point where you can't say, yeah, that person that I disagree with about a lot of things actually makes a point. And I think I'm going to change my mind and change my behavior as a result of that. And sometimes to the outside world, that may seem like you're clashing with your supposed faith. It's the way we think now. If so, fine. That's what makes people more of a human. That's what makes you more of a human being, I think, because in order for us to be good people, we do have to be able to see the other people, not just ideas, not just ideologies or parties or religions or anything else other than other people. And people are very complex. And so, as it says in that last point, not everything is a nail, right? Remember that phrase, at least in the United States, maybe for listeners that are not Americans, this might not be familiar, but we have this phrase that for a person who only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail, So if you have this theoretical or ideological lens that tells you what to think about everything, then you can just say, oh, it's that. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's that, right? Even though, no, it's actually something else. But that gets in the way of actually thinking and seeing the complex reality of the world. So anyway, hopefully that helps. I would encourage people to try this if they haven't already. I know many of my viewers are already fairly objective readers capable of doing precisely this. But if you're kind of new to this game, but you don't want to go down that slippery slope of just total I don't know what you want to call it, but just the echo chamber, type of thing. This is your way out if you're like a reader and interested in ideas. All right. So don't be that person that only has a hammer. Now, I put this up here because, and you'll be hearing more about this as time goes by, but I did publish this book very recently, The Gap in God's Country, a longer view on our culture wars. And I do think it's a better book that deals with many of the same concerns that J.D. Vance is dealing with but it's a different, I mean, J.D. Vance's book is a autobiographical piece. Okay. So it's just got a different mission too. It's not claiming to, solve larger problems. It does point to larger problems, though. But I would say if you're like at all concerned about some of the problems of poverty and dislocation and psychological issues, economic crises, and especially the rural-urban divide, the red-blue divide, what's going on, I think my book is better. It covers a lot of territory. So you will be hearing more about that. But yeah, book plug. If you haven't already gotten it, you can get it on Kindle for $9.99 from Amazon. I think the base price on Amazon right now for the paperback is $36. I just want to talk a little bit about the last couple of chapters of Vance's book. I know I haven't covered it all, but I try to pick the points that matter the most to me as I was reading it. So the last chapter before the conclusion, the actual conclusion, covers his mother's drug relapse and how he tries to help her. He's gone through, law school. He's at a different point in his life, but he goes back to try to help her to get her a place to live for a while. And as he writes about that, he's ruminating about the difference between his life and so many others who came from similar backgrounds like his own. And he realizes that he more or less kind of escaped. He escaped the fate of a lot of other people. And he ruminates about this issue throughout the book, kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, like, why did this happen for me, but not for a lot of other people? And he has entertained um, answers to that question that I just disagree with the focus, right? That a lot of the blame is on the people and the culture that can't quite get its act together. And he continues to do that here, that they can't get their act together, that they need to stop being so angry and stop conflict with each other and so on. So he's still doing some of that, but he does mention um, that he's aware. He's aware that he is, to a certain extent, just fortunate or lucky. Okay. One of the things he mentions is that he has a newfound faith at that point, right? And that he tries to apply that faith to how he deals with his mother at that point, as well as other people. So I think he's saying there that the Christian faith for him became a means of strength to be able to see, that he still needed to go back, help his mom, try to do the right thing. But at the same time, like so many of us who've had to deal with people who, for one reason or another, are not doing well in life, right? Because they seem to get in their own way. They seem to implode, right? Especially people in our lives who've got psychological and substance abuse issues. Vance realizes that you can help them, and you should, but you can't fix them. And the reason why you can't fix them is literally that they have to fix themselves. Um, we don't live in a country where, and this is probably good, but I'm not so sure. We don't live in a country where the government can just come and commit you if you're living on the streets, totally mind blown on opioids or whatever. Uh, can't be done. Government's not going to come and commit you and dry you out if you're a alcoholic. So because of that, friends and family members of people with these problems literally can only do so much. They can try to get the person help, and the person's going to refuse in a lot of cases. And at any rate, in the long run, even if we could somehow send them all to like mandatory rehab, it would still be on them ultimately, right? And we know they don't have good they don't have good muscles to deal with that task. And so it's likely not to work. And it feels really bad to know that, to know that there's only so much you can do. I speak from personal experience with a member of my own family, so I know how that feels. And you so wish that you could do something more, right? So he's feeling that. And he's also, there's this tone here of him realizing that the number one thing that he can do to move things forward in his family is to save himself. And that is not a bad thing. I find that to be a valid point. As I say there, you do have to put your oxygen mask on first, as they say, when, preparing you for if the plane goes down, right? Before you help the child, before you help the other person who needs help, because otherwise you're both going to suffocate. So that's just, I don't know, that's a good point. I certainly don't blame him for realizing that. As far as what should happen, in the ending of this book, Vance talks about some of the other things that did help him out, that through luck, maybe through a little bit more ability to find these advantages and take advantage of them. But he got lots of financial aid and scholarships to go to college. And this, without that, he wouldn't have been able to go. Now, right now, government has, especially in Republican states or red states, but I would say throughout the country, um, there is a lot less government infusion into public universities. And so the tuition has gone up and up, even at public universities. Um, Vance went to Yale for his law degree, but he did go to, I think, Ohio for his, I guess, his undergrad. And, it's just not as easy to get this aid as it used to be. And tuition has gone up because universities have to survive somehow. And if their state and federal resources are not there, they've got to get it from the students. So that's how that happens. He also comments on the fact that in his experience, direct experience, that child protective services were not very helpful, and that policing could be done better and take into account the children of people more, and mental illness could be handled better by police. Those are two good points, I think. He wished that he could have, when being handled, that it would have been very clear that the place he should go if his mother couldn't take care of him was his grandmother. And also, I think he's right, and I've done some reading into this subject, that a lot of police departments, they handle people with mental health problems and substance abuse problems just like they would a criminal. And there are certain municipalities that have adopted a much more seemingly rational and humane approach, where on a lot of calls, a social worker with a psychology background will go out with them, trained in intervention, to deal with people who aren't really any threat to society. They're really more a threat to themselves. People who know how to de-escalate and get people on the streets, or violent people who need help, uh, to that help if at all possible. But they're exemplars, right? Like they're outliers still, cities like that. So anyway, good points there. We all know that lots of times these helping agencies that you would expect to help, whether it's child protective services, foster care, or if it's, police, that they are, sometimes they become the problem because of bureaucratic inertia, blindness, bad characters involved, corruption. There's all sorts of problems that can go on. And then they don't help people, really. And he also says that Section 8 housing for the poor could be better managed. Right. So, I think at this point in time anyway, Vance was in touch enough with his own history, his own family history, to realize that some of these things helped, but they could have helped a lot more if they were done better. And he also says he was just fortunate that a lot of people did help him out along the way. And he does mention that his mom, despite all of her problems, really did get across the message that he, should value education. And his grandma respected that too. So in his dad for a little while was in his life, and there were other people along the way. So, he realizes that if it weren't for some of those messages that he got, maybe he wouldn't end up where he was. Um, And then he opines that hillbillies need to stop fighting each other and helping each other. They need to help each other out. So he focuses on, his own struggle with anger, and his culture's struggle with anger and fighting and chaos, right? And so he brings that message again. He also says that his culture, the hillbilly culture, tended to think that education was for girls, right? And that something that men shouldn't do because it wasn't manly. I definitely ran into that in my own schooling, only it wasn't just the message wasn't so much it wasn't for girls, or the message wasn't that it was just for girls. The message I got in the area I grew up was that education was for sissies, whether you were a girl or a boy, and that nobody who was at all cool could possibly like know things at the same time. I don't know. Like it was a thing, and I'm sure it still is, right? If you displayed smartness, because I'm obviously a female, it did not matter, right? I had to keep that under wraps pretty good, or else I was going to get clobbered. Okay, so like it's a bigger problem than Vance imagines maybe in this book because it's not just a hillbilly culture thing. It's it's ingrained in American culture. In my experience in the past anyway, it was a part of African American culture in the city that I grew up in. And I bet you anything that it's also the case in rural culture. So generally, so I think it's very prevalent, and it really is, shall I say, it's stupid. It's stupid. I think I've said this before, right? To denigrate education or to bully people who know things is the most retrograde attitude if you want your society to move forward that existed. So totally agree that we need to stop all that stuff. He also says the churches need to be stronger. He wished that he had gotten more help along the way, maybe from them, but he's also grateful for his conversion. But he does say that churches need to be stronger and more helpful to kids to, quote, face the world rather than withdraw from it. And I sort of took that to mean that instead of sort of cloistering kids and just protecting them, they needed to give them more mentoring and guidance in how to deal with the actual world. We definitely still have a problem with that in churches. Either churches don't really deal with youth much, or they try to protect them, like wrap them in bubble wrap so that they don't have any experience dealing with the incredibly complex and multicultural and multi faith space that we all live in. So good point. I don't know if you would still agree with some of these things, though. Um, he says we don't need to socialize at cocktail parties. Oh, and by the way, he had talked about this guy named Brian who had some of the same problems he did and was not faring too well. Anyway, he says we do need to create a space for the JDs and the Bryans of the world to have a chance. I don't know what the answer is precisely, but I know it starts when we stop blaming Obama or Bush or faceless companies and start asking ourselves what we can do to make things better. Yeah, I mean, who can disagree, right? Like, so decent point there. Um, and at the Maurin Academy, we do consistently bring that message. It's not that we shouldn't pay attention to who is in the Oval Office or in Congress, but if our attention isn't primarily on our own behavior, our own humanity and the humanity of others, our own relationships and how well we're doing with them, all that other stuff is BS. It's all talk. It's all ephemeral ideological blather um, for the sake of feeling like one has an identity. You're not going to have a strong identity if you're not a human being, social being, living in the world, seeing other people, caring about them, doing what you can to make your life and the lives of those right around you better. And that involves work. It involves time and work and throttling yourself back, you know, so that other people have space, right? And can actually be um, social as well, right? So all of those things, stop blaming Obama or Bush, Democrats or Republicans or corporations. Now, obviously, here's where we can bring the author back in as of today. And I just don't see today's J.D. Vance as he's running in this election as the vice presidential candidate being able to say this sentence. Because right now, he's a part of this campaign that is trying to get itself elected. And politicians just seem like they must go into the zone of blaming uh, the other side in the harshest terms possible. So, but it's a good quote, and it might be a quote to throw out there into the world because I think it shows, the lure of power can be so strong, it can be overwhelming, and it can overwhelm at least temporarily, our own moral compass and our character. Um, but people are very complex too. Uh, and who they are at one point in their lives is not necessarily completely who they are in another part of their lives. That is the truth. And again, I think it's worth reading outside of our personal lineup.